Hi, welcome to another episode on Where the Scriptures Become Real. Get a podcast where we learn, where we study, where we grow. We try to become the best versions of ourselves as we can as we continue to serve our Lord. For today's podcast, what we want to do is we want to get into a study, and we want to talk about the trials of true friendship. The trials of true friendship. And once we get done with this study, I think a good thing to do is to kind of compare that with your friends and compare that with the people that you call your friends, and to kind of see, are these my true friends? Are these my friends that are only here when I have this or that? But the life of Johnathan and David, and those are the two we're going to look at. We're going to look at their friendship specifically. And I want to see how through their trials and through all the things they went through as individuals, and then all the things they went through together, that their friendship, it's still held strong. All right. So let's look at this real quick. This is really good. I'm going to be studying this along with you. So again, if you're new to the podcast, use your Bibles, get your phone out, get your tablet, get your real Bible out, do whatever you have to do to get your Bibles out, because these are not going to be my opinions. These are not going to be my thoughts. These are not going to be my experiences. We're going to look at the Bible, and then we're going to take the application from the scripture to our lives. Okay. All right. So let's open our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. I'm really excited to do this study. I'm really excited for this. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 18. Now we're going to read a couple verses and we're going to jump around. So follow along with me here. But what we want to do is we want to set some stage. We want to set some context, and we want to set some background, so we can understand, and then once we kind of get to the end, we can kind of knit it all together, so it can work for us. We can apply these type of lessons for us. Okay. So we have Johnathan, Saul, and David. Now remember, when Goliath came on the scene, and when David killed Goliath, remember who was the king at the time? Saul. And Saul didn't want to fight. None of the people wanted to fight. Everyone was scared. David was the only one that wanted to fight, right? So now they start to fight. And then once David kills Goliath, then that's when David really starts to go into the life of Saul. And then David gets to know Saul. David gets to know Johnathan. David gets to know Michal, Saul's daughter. He gets to know all these people because he killed Goliath. Right? Now keep that in mind. Now, chapter 18 is kind of talking about the relationship between David and the Saul family. Okay? Now, let's read this. Verse number 1. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking, he said unto Saul, the end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Johnathan was knit with the soul of David, and Johnathan loved him as his own soul. Have you ever met somebody before? Like, it doesn't even have to be for a long time. Maybe it was just kind of like an instant connection with somebody. Maybe you just had a conversation, or maybe you hung out one time, and then you're like, man, I feel like I've known that person forever. Man, it feels like we've known each other for so long. Or have you ever had a friend where you haven't talked to this friend in a while, but then it doesn't matter if it's 5 years, 10 years, 1 month, a couple weeks, you could always go back to where y'all left off, right? And so that's what it means to have your soul knit to one another. And so David's soul was knit to the soul of Johnathan. And if you understand those examples, you understand what the Bible's talking about here. To have your soul knit with somebody. I'm not talking about a soul mate, but your soul is knit to a person. You're so close to that person that time, distance, trial, all that stuff doesn't really matter, because all that matters is that person's okay, and that person, all that matters is that you're okay. That's what it means to have your soul knit to somebody. And so now let's keep going. Now we're learning more about Saul and his family. And so then when Saul saw first that Jonathan's soul was knit to David, verse number 2, and Saul took David that day and would not let him go no more to his father's house. So Saul took David and said, look, you stay with us. And so now David is now staying with the Saul family. So you have David, Saul, his wife, Michal, his daughter, and Johnathan. And David's there now, right? And so then verse 3, then Johnathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Johnathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David and his garments, even his sword and his bow and his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him. And notice, if you like, I like to highlight, circle. I like to take notes and stuff in my Bible. Circle, highlight, underline. Do what you have to do for verse number 5. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him. Underline that really quick. Now, David was again Saul's servant. So Saul's the one that sent him out to kill Goliath. Then Saul welcomes him into his home, and whatever Saul tells David to do, David goes out and he does it. But notice how David does it. Look at the next part of the verse. David went out wheresoever Saul sent him, and he behaved himself how? Wisely. I'm telling you, that's gonna matter later. He behaved himself wisely. And Saul, seeing that David behaved himself well, he set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. And then notice, now we're going to skip around here, but just to give you some context, so from verses 6 all the way down to verse 10, David goes out just like Saul tells him to, and he goes out and he kills these Philistines, right? And he kills the Philistines, and he does it, and he does it. And every time he comes back, then the women start to praise David. Then the women start to say, well, Saul's killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s, right? Now they're starting to revere David more than they revere Saul. Then the Bible in verse 9 says, and Saul eyed David from that day forward. Then, if we keep going, now remember, we're talking about this is the stuff that happens in the Saul household. Then verse 11, and Saul cast a javelin, and he said, I will smite David even to the wall. But David avoided it, and he avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David. Why? Because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. And Saul removed him from him, and made him captain over 1,000, and he went out and he came himself before the people. Now, look at verse number 14. So David lost his position. Saul removed him and only put him over 1,000 men, not over 10,000s of men, to try to lower his credibility. But even though Saul throws a javelin at David twice, tries to kill him, and even though Saul takes away his position and puts him in a lesser position, highlight in your Bible again, verse number 14, even though all this stuff was happening to David in the Saul household, what did David do? And David, verse number 14, behaved himself wisely in all of his ways, and the Lord was with him. Now let's set this background really quick. When there is conflict between families, when there is conflict between brethren, when there's conflict between just people in general, in the church, in life, you know the best thing that you can do is no matter what they do, right? No matter what has been done, no matter what is being done, no matter what they do, it doesn't give you an excuse to do what you do. What did David do? Did David have the right to get mad? Yeah. Did David have the right to do what he wanted? Yeah. But guess what he decided to do? David chose to behave himself wisely. Let me pull this book out really quick. I want you guys to see this. I know this is just a side note, but right now I'm reading this book, if you can see it. The 5 Love Languages for Singles. I recommend singles reading this, married people, everybody read this. It's a great book. But one thing it talks about with love, it talks about that love always chooses despite what's been done to you as an individual. So David, and I always wonder, why did David take all this junk from Saul? Why did he do that? Why did he take all this junk from his best friends, the person he was knitted to, their family? Why did he take all this junk from them? He did it because he loved Johnathan and he cared about his friend. And so David chose to behave himself wisely, even though the person that he was friends with, his family, hated him. He chose to behave himself wisely. You know, that can solve a lot of issues today. Remember, we're talking about the trials of friendship. In order for David to be friends with Johnathan, David himself had to endure Jonathan's family. Jonathan's family hated him. Saul hated him. All his servants probably hated him because Saul hated him. But David chose to behave himself wisely. Where's he behaving himself wisely at? In Saul's house. Why? I'm taking all this punishment. I'm taking all this degradation. I'm taking all this stuff. Why? Because I care about Johnathan. That's my friend. So I'm choosing to behave myself wisely. You know, if we choose to behave ourselves wisely, regardless of what other people do, regardless of what other families do, notice what God will do for you if you choose that. The end of verse number 14. And the Lord was with David. You see, God will be with you even though other people hate you. If you choose to behave yourself wisely in situations, God will be with you. And he was with David. Now, this is just the background of the friendship that David had with Johnathan. Now, if we keep going, now we get into, now it gets a little more complicated. Because now, David not only has a friendship with Johnathan, but now someone else sees David acting wisely. Now Saul's daughter and Jonathan's sister now has eyes for David. Ooh, now it's starting to get real. All right, now let's jump down to verse number 17. Now here's what Saul's plan was. Saul's plan was, I want you to marry this girl. So, and Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter Merab, I will give to you to wife. Only be valiant just for me. Fight for me and the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said to Saul, who am I? What is my life that I should be son-in-law to the king? David said, man, I don't even deserve your daughter. I don't even deserve your older daughter. Who am I, a shepherd boy, that I should be a son-in-law to a king? Right? Who am I? So David has some humility about himself still. But then verse 19, but it came to pass that when it was time for Merab, Saul's older daughter, to marry David, Merab was given away to Adriel to wife. So now his older daughter's married. But verse number 20, but Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. So think about the situation that David's in real quick. So David comes into this family's life. David loves Johnathan. They're best friends. Their souls are knit together. But your best friend's dad has tried to kill you twice and has degraded your position. But you still choose to behave yourself extremely wise, and the Lord is with you. So then on top of that, the family that hates you, not only does Saul hate you, and it's hard for you to even probably see Johnathan, then out of nowhere, then Jonathan's sister loves you. Okay, so now what do I do? So notice this. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. But why would it please Saul that Michal loved David? This is why. Because Saul wanted to use his own daughter to get to David, which is so bogus. But that's how much Saul hated David. And so he said, I will use him that she might be a snare unto him. And then verse 22, then Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly, and said, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. So he tries to trick David. And then if you jump down in chapter 18, if you jump down all the way to verse number 27, notice this, and David arose and went, and he and his men, and then they slew the Philistines, which Saul told him to do. So he slew the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins and gave them to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And David gave Michal his daughter to wife. And Saul knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Man, so you got to think about that. We really gloss over this. That's a hard situation for David to be in. So, your father hates me, Johnathan. You're my best friend. Our souls are knit together, Johnathan. But your father hates me. Then, your sister loves me. And, you want to marry your sister. So how am I going to be friends with you? How am I going to love your sister when the rest of your family hates me? Man, think about how hard that is for David. But notice this, and Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. So now you imagine you're David, you're in Saul's house. Johnathan, you're my best friend. By the way, your sister loves me, and I probably love your sister, but your dad hates me continually. And other members of your family hate me continually. Oh, my man. Then, verse number 30, then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth, again, so what do I do? What do I do in this situation? Bro, you've been my friend forever. Then I really care about your sister, but your dad hates me. Then your dad's servants hate me. Then the rest of your family hates me. What do I do? Verse number 30. Then David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, and that his name was set much by. So what do I do in this situation? I remember in school, one of our instructors, Brother Keith Mosier, we were talking about funerals, and we were talking about, well, what do we do during funerals? And, Brother Mosier said, well, you just need to be there, and I remember one student was saying, well, shouldn't I do this and do that and do this and do that? Like, I feel like I'm not doing anything. I'm just here. Brother Mosier kept on saying, that's your job. Just be there. And so notice David just did what he was supposed to do. David didn't do anything out of the ordinary. David didn't try to one up Saul so he can be seen as better, so that his daughter and Johnathan can see him as better than Saul. He never disrespected Jonathan's father. He never disrespected Michal's father. He never disrespected Johnathan or Michal's family. He's always said great things about them. He's always helped them. David behaved himself wisely, even though that family hated him. So you might ask yourself, well, if I'm ever in that situation, what do I do? You behave yourself wisely. And notice at the end of verse 30, David behaved himself more wisely than everybody else. You see, the Lord is always going to be with you. You talk about true friendship. You talk about the trials of true friendship. This is what true friendship will do. It will always behave itself wisely. And they don't do it for themselves, because remember in 1 Corinthians 13, what does love never do? it never thinks about self. So David chose to love Johnathan, even though Saul hated him. David chose to love Michal, even though Saul hated him. David chose to love Saul, even though Saul hated him continued. I learned no matter what you do, some people will just hate you just to hate you. Did David ever do anything wrong in the Saul family? From what we read in scripture, all David has done was help the Saul family. But David was always rewarded for evil. People will hate you continually for no reason. And here's the reason why Saul hated David. Because he was afraid of him. Sometimes people hate you because they're afraid of you. Sometimes people hate you continually because they want the life that you're living. Some people will hate you continually because some people wish they were you. They wish they had what you had. That's why people hate you. And so if you notice, David had all of these situations going on at one time. But he behaved himself wisely. You talk about true friendship. David loved Johnathan. David loved Michal. David loved Saul. He never disrespected them. And in the open, he never disrespected them. Behind closed doors, he never disrespected them. He always loved the Saul family, regardless of what the Saul family did to him. That's behaving yourself wisely. Yeah, things might not personally work out for you because David had a javelin thrown at him twice. David was degraded from his position. But David behaved himself. What will true friendship do? It will always behave itself. Okay, so let's switch the situation. So what if Jesse and then David's brothers hated Saul and his family? If Johnathan and Michal were true friends to David, what would Johnathan and Michal... So what if Jesse hated Johnathan and Michal just like Saul hated David? True friendship, Johnathan and Michal would have never ever disrespected Jesse. Johnathan and Michal would have never ever disrespected David's brothers. You see, love never disrespects. Well, Jordan, you don't understand what David did. You don't understand what Saul did. You don't understand the hatred. We don't have to understand that. See, some people think because of what other people do, it gives me the right to do this. No, it doesn't. When people treat you wrong, whether they're in the church or out of the church, you never have the right to do what you want to do. If we're Christians, we live to a higher standard. I've had people call me names before. I've had people talk behind my back before. Does that give me the right? No. Why? Because I live to a higher standard. I'm trying to be like Christ. So guess what I'm going to do when people talk about me? When people do, behave myself wisely. How do you think Joseph got through what he went through when Potiphar's wife accused him of doing things sexually with him? How do you think Joseph got through all that? Guess what Joseph he chose? I'm going to behave myself wisely. And if my memory is correct in Genesis, what does the Bible say? And the Lord was with Joseph. Here in 1 Samuel, what does the Bible say? If you behave yourself wisely, despite the junk that other people give to you, and the Lord was with David. So what's our answer? Our answer is to behave ourselves wisely. Now, really quick, I want to look at the covenant that Johnathan makes. Now, I want to see things from Jonathan's side. Now we've just seen things from David's side. I want you to see things from, because you always want to see things from each side. That will help you in life. So that'll help you in life. That'll help you in general in relationships. That'll help you in a lot of problem solving. You have to see things from the other perspective, not just yours. Okay, so so from this point, that's David's perspective. Now let's see it from Jonathan's perspective. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 20, if you'll read the whole chapter, but this is what I'll do. I'll kind of give you a review of what happens here. So Jonathan and David make a covenant now. Okay, so basically, if you don't know what covenant means, make a promise to each other. And covenants were very serious then. They were extremely serious, especially between men. Now, here's what happens. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but I want it from verse 1 to verse 20. This is essentially what happens. So remember, David is friends with Jonathan. Jonathan friends with David, right? So David and Jonathan, they have this conversation. And Jonathan's saying, look, man, my dad hates you. I know we're friends, but this friendship is difficult because my family hates you. And David's like, man, I know. Like, I understand. Now, remember, where's David staying? Jonathan's house. But Jonathan's family hates him. So David's like, man, I can't come back, man, because your dad hates me. So David said, look, I got a plan. See, this is what we'll do. David says, this is how we'll know if your father still hates me or not. David says, I want you to tell him, at the dinner table, he's going to ask where I am because I'm not there. So David said, I want you to tell him I went back to Bethlehem where I was born. I went back there to go make a sacrifice with my family. So I went back to my city. And so Jonathan said, okay, that's great, but how am I going to let you know if my father hates you or not if you're in Bethlehem? So how do I know this? And so then David's like, man, all right. So David said, okay, that's a good point. How will I know? And so David and Jonathan, then they walk out to this field. And I can see them talking because I've had these conversations. Haven't you've ever had a hypothetical conversation before? We've all had it. You remember when we wanted to spend the night at somebody else's house growing up? Okay, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go ask your mom this, and then I'll go ask my mom this, and then we'll talk to our dads. And then if they say this, then we'll say, you know what I'm saying? We've all had those conversations. So David and Jonathan are now having this conversation. So they're standing in the field, and Jonathan said, you see that rock over there, the stone Ezel? David said, yeah, I see it. He said, this is what we're going to do. You're going to hide in the field. I'm going to have a young boy with me. And Jonathan was great with the bow and arrow. And so Jonathan said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to shoot 3 arrows. And I'm going to shoot these arrows at the rock. And if the arrows land on this side of the rock, that means you can go pick them up. And that is a sign that my father doesn't hate you and there's peace. And you can come back. But then he says, if I shoot these arrows and they go beyond the stone Ezel, that means you got to get out. It means my father still hates your guts. You got to go. And then the lad will go and grab those beyond the rock. And David said, okay. And so then, after this happens, so they got this plan devised. And they said, okay. And so then they made the covenant. Now, we got D-Day. Now the day is here. So dinner rolls around. The Saul family's there. I presume Saul, his wife, Michael, Jonathan, they're all there sitting at the dinner table. And so, let's start in verse 29 of chapter 20. And he said, let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath a sacrifice into the city. So wait. So before we get there, so now they're at the table, and now Jonathan or Saul asks, where's the son of Jesse at? Where's David at? And then verse 29, then Jonathan says, well, David said, let me go. Yeah, Dad, David said, our family hath a sacrifice in the city, and my brother, he hath commanded me to be there. And now if I have found favor in your eyes, let me go away, I pray thee. Let me see my brethren. Therefore, that's why he's not at the dinner table, Dad. He said he had to go back to Bethlehem. He said there was a sacrifice. That's why he's not there. And so notice, remember we're talking about what a tried and true friendship will do. First, on both sides individually, they will both act wise with each other's families. Johnathan will act wise with David and his family. David will act wise with Jonathan's family. That's the first one. Then what will a tried and true relationship do? It will always protect the other individual. Notice the stuff, because each side had to deal with. So David had to deal with Jonathan's hate. Now Jonathan's in his home and he has to deal with his own father's hate. Watch verse 30. So after Jonathan says this, then Saul's anger was kindled against Johnathan, and he said, "You son of this perverse woman, of this rebellious perverse woman," he said, "Don't you think I know that you have chosen the son of Jesse by your own confusion?" So, notice the tactic that Saul is trying to use to Johnathan. He's trying to emotionally manipulate him. So, son, you're saying you're choosing the son of Jesse than your father? What's wrong with you? You see, he's trying to emotionally manipulate his own son. Why would you choose that boy? Why would you choose him over your own father? What's wrong with you? Then he says, in the confusion of thy mother's nakedness, for as long as the son of Jesse. Now, after the emotional manipulation, then verse 31, now it's time to give us some threats. Now, listen to me, since you chose David. For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon this earth, you will never be established. You will never have your kingdom. And wherefore now send forth and go get him, so that I can kill him right now. Okay, so we've seen David's problems. Now we're seeing a glimpse of Jonathan's issues. So now Johnathan is being accused of not loving his family because he cares about his friend. Now Johnathan, he also has been promised. Remember, if you're the son of a king, you're supposed to be the heir to the throne. Now Saul has said, as long as you're with him, you'll never have a kingdom. This kingdom it'll never be yours. Okay. Then after that, he says, then now I want you to go get him and bring him back to this house so I can kill him tonight. Bro. So now we see things from David's perspective, and now we see things. So think about how strong the relationship between David and Johnathan had to be. Even though the families behaved themselves terribly, both of them, David and Johnathan, acted wisely. Both of them. That's a hard situation to be in. They both handled themselves wisely. Then on top of that, then they both protected one another in public and in private. Then he said, look, go. Then notice, then verse 32, then Johnathan said, look, why should he be slain? Verse 32. What hath he done? What has David ever done to you? What has David ever done to us? Then Saul cast a javelin at him to spite him. Then Johnathan knew that his father was going to kill David. So Saul did the same thing to Johnathan that he did to David. They must have had, at the dinner table, they must have had some spears on hand at all times. Because he throws two at David and misses. Saul's aim must have been terrible too. He throws two and he throws it at David. Then he's mad at his own son. Pass me the javelin. Then he throws it at his own son too. It's a tough situation to be in. It's a very hard situation to be in. But notice verse 42. So then Jonathan followed along with the plan. He goes outside. He brings the lad, shoots the arrows past the rock Ezel. Then David knows, oh, man, I can't do it. So then Jonathan goes and sees David. In verse 32, and Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went to the city. Imagine being in this friendship and you love this person, but because of problems, right here in 1 Samuel 20, this could potentially, actually, this was the last time that David saw Jonathan alive. Man, imagine just having to do this with your friend for their safety. Jonathan said, man, you can't, I want you to be here with me, man. You got to go, though. Because if you stay, I'm trying to protect you. And David saying, man, if I stay, then I don't want you to get hurt. So they're both, you see, that's what a knit friendship is. Man, even if that means I got to leave, I want what's best for you. Right? And Jonathan wanted the exact same thing. But now I want you to turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 31. Then, we all know that the sad thing happens here. Saul dies. And then the Philistines slew David and the rest of Saul's sons too. And so imagine being David, hearing this. Now Saul's dead. Jonathan's dead now. But I want you to notice the words that David said about Saul and Jonathan. If you start in 2 Samuel chapter 1 in verse number 23, notice kind of the eulogy that David gives. David could have said a lot of things about Saul. Man, Saul, y'all, I'm glad I'm not on the run anymore. You know how many times he tried to kill me? You know how many times he threw the javelin at me? You know how many times I was on the run? You know how many times he hated me? You know how many? He could have said some evil stuff. Even in Saul's death, he could have said evil things about Saul. But notice what David decided to do because of Jonathan. Saul and Jonathan, verse 23 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Saul and Jonathan were lovely, and they were pleasant in their lives. What is David doing right here? What we talked about before. David is behaving himself wisely. It's incredible, man. They were lovely, and they were pleasant in their lives. And in their death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. Verse 25, how mighty have the fallen in battle. O Jonathan, thou wast slain in high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, the sad thing about it is people will read this and think it was, David and Jonathan were in a relationship. But they weren't. The love that Jonathan had for David was beyond the love of woman. Why? Because Jonathan protected David at all costs. Jonathan went through the risk of his father for him, or went through the wrath of his father for David. Jonathan risked his life for David. That's why David, he was making a comparison. He said, look, man, I haven't even met a woman who would do that. And you have. So how do we, the trials and tribulations of true friendship, from Jonathan and David, and learning from the Saul family and David. No matter what's been done to you, no matter what's been said about you, you have a moral responsibility, and you have a responsibility to Christ. to behave yourself wisely. That's my responsibility. That's your responsibility. Behave yourself wisely. Then number 2, if you're really friends with that person, you will protect that person. You talk about true friendship. I hope y'all got friends like that, because that's the type of friendship that I'm looking for, and just some of my boys. But that's a friendship I'm looking for with a wife too. And sometimes we can get caught in ourselves and think, well, this has never happened to anybody else. The Bible has everything that pertains to life and godliness. We just got to find it and look for it. And so I hope that, as we've studied this today, the life of Johnathan and David, that your friendship can improve, that you can work on your individual self. Hopefully that, other people work on themselves too, and that we can work together. And if we behave ourselves wisely, and if we protect one another, the Lord will be with us. Thanks, guys.